Captain Daniel Elfrith was like a man from another age, more an Elizabethan buccaneer than a colonial settler, a grizzled veteran of Caribbean adventure. He made his mark on the world by sailing dangerous seas, fighting and robbing the Spanish as opportunity arose, and involved himself, in one way or another, in nearly every English colonial scheme of the last generation. He was the first man to sell slaves in Virginia, the plundered cargo of a Portuguese slave ship. He had then established himself in Bermuda, where he knocked heads with the Puritan faction on the island. Now he was roving across the Spanish West Indies on the lookout for easy pillage. He came across an island with a natural defense of reefs and rocks, and uninhabited but for a few friendly Dutch interlopers. Elfrith saw an opportunity, a new English colony situated in a perfect location for English pirates to enrich themselves at Spain's expense. He returned to Bermuda and began his search for backers to his plan. This is the story of pirates, Puritans, political radicals, and idealistic imperialists gathered from England and from Bermuda, setting out to strike at the heart of the Spanish Empire by establishing a new English colony off the coast of Central America that would seek to somehow combine religious utopianism, cash crop plantations, and buccaneering. It is a tale of grand colonial ambition and thwarted imperial dreams. This is the history of England's colony at Providence Island. Before I commence the main narrative, do me a favor, please like and subscribe. It really helps me a lot when you do that. Thank you. In 1630, English empire building in the Americas is already a generation old, but the results so far have been pretty uninspiring. A few settlements in the Chesapeake and New England, Bermuda, and a handful of islands on the eastern fringe of the Lesser Antilles are all that can be boasted of. None have been possessed for much more than 2 decades, some for only a few years. While the settlement of these lands involved great challenges and, in some cases, the future rewards would be great, a common telling feature they all had in 1630 is they were outside core Spanish interests in the Americas. If Spain and Portugal had enjoyed a feast of conquests over the course of the last century, England was making do of the leftovers. Which is not to say Spain took the presence of English, French, and Dutch interlopers lightly. They regularly sought to dislodge them. By residing at the geographic edges, the newcomers made Spanish attempts to remove them that little bit harder and that somewhat less urgent. Of all the new English colonies, the standout success in 1630 was Bermuda, a collection of islands in the North Atlantic, approximately 2/3 the way across from England. Englishmen first settled the islands entirely by accident after being shipwrecked there in 1609 on their way to join the slightly older colony in Virginia, a story I recounted in my video, How Bermuda Became English. Bermuda will play a key role in England's venture in Providence Island. Of all England's colonies at this time, Bermuda was the most successful. It had a plantation economy growing tobacco, and it had a self-reproducing population long before any other English colony did, thanks to the island's healthy environment. Bermuda was thus able to play the role of mother colony, a source of settlers, leaders, resources, and experience that could be used in the Caribbean and in continental America. The Providence Island adventure will begin in 1630 when a group of high-ranking and historically significant English Puritans received a patent from England's government for establishing a new colony in the Western Caribbean. English colonialism at this time worked on a private enterprise footing, with private adventurers more or less connected to a political establishment in England receiving a patent giving them monopoly over trade and settlement in this or that region of the New World. Besides this official documentation, the adventurers were mostly on their own. The English state did not typically anticipate providing any further support. The recruitment of settlers, sailors, and soldiers, the dispatch of ships, the purchase of supplies and arms were all the responsibility of the company. This company, established on the 4th of December, was named the Governor and Company of Adventurers of the City of Westminster for the plantation of the islands of Providence or Catalina, Henrietta or Andrea, and the adjacent islands lying upon the coast of America. The island of Providence, the main target of settlement, is east of modern Nicaragua in Central America, then part of New Spain, the heart of Spain's vast American empire. This choice of location was a direct and deliberate affront to Spanish supremacy in the region. The men involved in establishing the company were important figures of their era. Two deserve special mention. First, John Pym, one of the great figures of England's 17th century. He would go on to be the leader of the parliamentary side of the English Civil War in its first years, before the rise of Oliver Cromwell. Second, Robert Rich, the Earl of Warwick, who was already heavily involved with virtually all colonial ventures of the previous 2 decades, including the settlement of Bermuda and the voyage of the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower to Massachusetts. Both these men were Puritans, religious reformers hoping to purge the Church of England of its residual Catholicism. Puritan politics could vary quite a lot, but Pym and Warwick would both be on the parliamentarian side of the coming Civil War. Indeed, the list of founding members of the company is like a who's who of leading Puritan figures from the early years of the Civil War. That's a story for another time, but it demonstrates that this was a close-knit group with common political aims. Pym and Warwick had learnt of Providence Island from Philip Bell, governor of Bermuda and son-in-law of Captain Daniel Elfrith, who we met earlier, the first Englishman to visit Providence Island. Elfrith wasn't the man to recruit respectable support from the English elite, but Philip Bell, as the Puritan governor of Bermuda, did have the necessary connections. What were these Puritans after in settling Providence? What were their aims? Essentially, the experience and hopes of all the other colonies coalesced into a single dream. First, they intended the settlers to establish a plantation economy, like that in Bermuda and Virginia, growing tobacco or cotton or any other cash crop that England depended on imports for. Secondly, they hoped to engage in an illicit trade with Spanish territories in Central America and the Caribbean. Illicit because the Spanish authorities forbade foreign trading ships. Thirdly, they wanted Providence to be a staging post for piracy, rekindling the Elizabethan tradition of heroic sea dogs laying waste to Spanish towns and shipping. Finally, there were important political and religious motivations. Just like in England, Puritans hoped that an ideal religious community could be established, a colony of men and women in a closer union with God than was possible in the old country. For them, this fitted perfectly well with piratical raids on the Spanish, because Spain, as the great Catholic empire of the day, was the new Babylon, sword of Satan, the enemy of God and true religion. King Charles' foreign policy had involved nothing but disappointments for anti-Spanish Puritans, so they sought ways for good, patriotic Englishmen to take the fight to the old enemy without the immediate involvement of the state. Good evidence that the religious and political motivations were strong in the men establishing the company is that during the colony's short existence, whenever Pym, Warwick and their friends were asked to provide extra funds, they did so, far beyond what investors in other colonies were typically willing to pay. This was part business venture, part crusade. And so, the Seaflower, sister ship of the famous Mayflower, set sail from England in February 1631, carrying men, and only men, from Essex, Northamptonshire, Oxfordshire, Cornwall, Devon and Wales, selected with some care for good Puritans. On arrival, they found a detachment of settlers from Bermuda led by Captain Elfrith and Philip Bell, who had arrived earlier, as well as a handful of Dutch rovers who had decided to stick around. Bell was made governor of the new colony, and Elfrith was made its admiral. On its return journey to England, the Seaflower got a violent taste of what was in store for the settlers themselves in their new West Indian venture. The usual route back to Europe from the Caribbean was the Florida Straits, separating Florida and Cuba. While sailing through, the Seaflower was sighted by a well-armed Spanish ship, which gave pursuit and caught up with them. A fierce fight ensued, fought more with the sword and the pistol than with the cannon. The Spanish boarded the English ship 3 times, but each time were repulsed with casualties. Having taken a bloody nose, the Spanish gave up and withdrew, allowing the English to continue on their way. 4 Englishmen died, more were wounded, and the captain lost an eye. In accordance with company instructions, the settlers got to work straight away. Maize and tobacco were immediately planted, the one for sustenance and the other for cash. Captain Elfrith was dispatched around the Caribbean to find suitable plants to bring to the island, and he came back with sugarcane, figs, and oranges. During this trip, the old sea dog also found time to steal a Spanish ship from Jamaica, leaving them his old leaky ship as a replacement. The settlers also got to work fishing and turtle hunting. There would be no repeat in Providence of the starving time that afflicted early colonial Virginia in previous decades. England was slowly maturing as a colonialist nation. The nearby island of Henrietta, named for the French wife of King Charles, was also quickly occupied, as it was a good source of timber for the main settlement, as well as for shipbuilding. Forts were established at various points around the island, with gunners on the company payroll. They knew, sooner or later, that the Spanish would be coming. The men were broadly in 3 classes. There were planters, those who would establish farms and share profits 50-50 with the company. Then there were craftsmen, employed directly by the company, and then bonded labourers working for a master in exchange for food and board. This was a more or less conventional English social structure for the time, nothing radical or surprising to anybody involved. Where this miniature society did diverge noticeably from convention was in the way the men were grouped into so-called families, which were meant to police the moral behaviour of their own members, a reflection of the colony's Puritan aspirations. The earliest years of the colony looked promising and the population grew, with 80 settlers arriving from Bermuda in 1632 and more later from England, this time including that most vital colonial asset, women. Maritime activities were not neglected either, both trade and piracy. The trade to and from the island was carried largely by the Dutch, and it is an interesting feature of this stage of England's colonial history that the Dutch were very supportive. They were perfectly happy to see rivals to Spain set up shop as long as they, the Dutch themselves, could get in on the carrying trade. English ships from Providence explored the coast of Central America to look for new trade opportunities. Not only did they hope to engage in an illegal trade with the Spanish themselves, but also with the native peoples who in much of the country still lived effectively free of Spanish rule. The English succeeded in making peaceable contacts with the natives, and John Pym applied for an additional patent for trade monopoly over this territory, the Mosquito Coast. This part of the venture would have mixed success. The company was adamant that their people should go in peace and set instructions that sailors should be forbidden to mock the nakedness of the native women. It started off well enough. A permanent trading post was established, and some Mosquito Coast people would row over and visit them in Providence itself. But later, a Dutch ship visiting the same coastline would get into a violent confrontation with the locals, causing them to become more wary of Europeans generally. The company also expanded its operation to include Tortuga off the coast of Hispaniola, which they named Association Island. They kept this as a separate colony with a very different colonial regime. It was already a haunt for an international mix of buccaneers, English, French, and Dutch, who at this stage in Caribbean history got on quite well together as common enemies of the Spanish hegemon. So the company embraced the island's piratical role from the start and did not attempt to impose a Puritan settlement there. As for piracy from Providence Island itself, if not dramatically successful, it did lead to the incorporation of a whole new type of resident, the African slave, captured from their erstwhile Spanish masters. It was not at all apparent at the time that the future of the West Indies was to be as a slave society, with a mass of Africans ruled over by a tiny European elite. This still lies in the future. Slavery-based plantations were seen as just one of many possible modes of economic organization at this stage. The company itself issued regulations limiting the slave population to less than half the white population, though, towards the end of the colony's history, the settlers had greatly transgressed this limit. The men on the ground were also not unanimously in favor of slavery, One Puritan man, Samuel Rishworth, was so disgusted at the enslavement that he assisted several of the slaves to escape. The escapees then hid themselves in a small wood, and it took much effort to recapture them. Rishworth was rebuked by the company, but not severely punished. Slavery would be a part of the colony. Social discord, an all too common feature of colonial ventures, quickly materialized. The company was aggrieved to hear reports that dice playing, drunkenness, and dancing between men and women were popular pastimes on the island. They issued instructions that these should be suppressed and suggested that men take up shooting as a hobby instead. No doubt, guns can be entertaining, but one has to wonder if they are really an absolute replacement for alcohol and women. The company also sacked the church minister of the island for his fondness for singing the occasional secular song. One has to marvel at the expectations of the company directors. They sent men to an entirely undeveloped tropical island where they'll be starved of entertainment and, initially, of female company, then expects them to conduct themselves like saints while also moonlighting as pirates. Tensions between company and colonist and between Puritan and non-Puritan would persist throughout the colony's existence. It took the Spanish a few years to start dealing with the trespassers. In 1635, the governor of Cartagena, Don Nicolas de Judice, set about to drive the English out. He landed 300 men on the 2nd of July, 1635, 5 years after settlement had begun. Perhaps if he'd come earlier, he would have been more successful. But the English were now too well established, with their forts manned by professional gunners and their men organized into a militia, to be defeated by such a small force. And Don Nicolas was forced to withdraw. However, the Spanish will be back. Far from resting on their laurels after such a victory, the company decided that the Spanish offensive meant things would have to change in the colony. They decided that the primary future of the colony should be in piracy. They asked for and received a right of reprisal from King Charles, which was interpreted as a general right to conduct raids on Spanish territory and shipping. There was supposed to be a system of profit sharing. The pirates were meant to share 1/5 of the value of their prizes with the company. In practice, this was very hard to enforce, with the mariners regularly underreporting their winnings. At the same time, the company dropped the profit-sharing arrangement with the planters. From now on, the planters just paid a regular rent for use of the land. These changes indicated that the company expected the big returns to be made from Spanish victims rather than the soil of Providence Island itself. Meanwhile, the Spanish had also attacked the company's other island colony, Tortuga. As mentioned, Tortuga was populated by an international gang of rovers. The island had been provided with fort and artillery, and in turn the governor, himself an old English pirate from the Lesser Antilles, was meant to ensure the activities of the island, mercantile or piratical, enriched the company. Instead, the governor pocketed the money for himself. There was no discipline on the island, and so 250 Spanish soldiers were able to land and walk around the harbour fort unopposed. The unruly residents scattered. Most were caught and executed immediately. A few escaped to Hispaniola. Now, all the company's immediate plans would be concentrated on Providence Island. Not long after, the island received a new governor, Captain Robert Hunt. He was meant to enforce the new changes and enforce good moral behavior. His remit was to create Puritan pirates of the Caribbean. As an enthusiastic Puritan himself, he got right to work. What about our old friends Daniel Elthwith and Governor Philip Bell? Daniel Elthwith had come to be seen as a loose cannon, uncontrollable by the company and regularly falling out with his peers on the island. His son-in-law, Governor Bell, while a Puritan by personal persuasion, had always tried to follow a middle path between the factions, balancing them one against each other. Unfortunately, this had only meant both sides wrote to England complaining about him. So both men were out of favour. It's not entirely clear from the record what was Elthwith's ultimate fate, but Philip Bell, after some serious ups and downs, would ultimately go on to be the governor of Barbados, the third colony for which he held the title. The island's population stood at about 500 white men, 40 women, and 90 black slaves. However, after the initial enthusiasm of the early years, it would be increasingly hard to attract new settlers. The problem was, apparently, not that people didn't want to join a den of pirates, but that they didn't want to join a den of Puritans. Many of those in England looking across the Atlantic for opportunities didn't fancy having their dice games and dancing regulated. Those who were of the Puritan persuasion already had other options. They could go to Bermuda, where Puritan influence was strong, or to New England, where it was absolutely dominant. Indeed, some figures in New England were actively hostile to the Providence Island venture precisely because they believed it would distract from a Puritan concentration in their own colony. The colony's piratical endeavors picked up pace and became more ambitious, meeting both failure and victory. In 1636, a former fort commander of Providence named William Roos led 2 ships in a raid on Santa Marta on the north coast of Colombia. However, one of the 2 ships became becalmed, and the remaining ship under Roos went on alone. The English attackers landed, but found themselves badly outnumbered. They were forced into an embarrassing surrender and would spend many years in captivity in Spain. In 1638, Providence's next governor, Nathaniel Butler, would lead a similar expedition against Spanish settlements on the coast of Honduras, but this time the English, along with some Dutch allies, had fortune on their side. They captured the town of Trujillo and were able to extract a hefty ransom from the occupants. These 2 exploits would have been of the larger variety for Providence. Most of their piratical activity was on a far smaller scale, but it must have been enough to trouble the Spanish because they were soon renewing their efforts to take the island. As the colony entered its last years, the pendulum swung against Puritanism. The priority was booty, not Bibles, and the replacement of the hardline Robert Hunt with Nathaniel Butler reflected that. The new governor, a 61-year-old privateer who had previously served as governor of Bermuda, was more in the mold of an Elizabethan naval hero than Puritan farmer. When personally leading expeditions against the Spanish, he left the island in control of Deputy Governor Andrew Carter, who similarly was there in the Caribbean to fight and rob the Spanish, not preach. In 1640, 10 years after the beginning of the colony, 6 frigates and a galleon headed to Providence. The Spanish commander brought substantially more troops than in Spain's last attempt to take the island. 800 Spanish soldiers and 200 black militiamen, thus outnumbering the population of Providence almost twice over. The fighting was fierce, the English forts once again putting the Spanish to the test. They suffered 100 casualties on land, and then the approach of a storm forced the fleet to withdraw, leaving some Spanish on the island as prisoners. Titular Governor Nathaniel Butler was away in England. Andrew Carter was in command. He could claim a significant victory over the Spanish, but his actions in the immediate aftermath of victory undermined his position. He ordered the Spanish prisoners to be executed. This brutal action deepened inexorably the rift that already existed between the buccaneering Andrew Carter and the leading Puritan settlers of the island. They spoke out openly against Carter's actions, which gave Carter the pretext to have 4 of them arrested for undermining civil authority. The arrested men included 2 Puritan ministers, as well as 2 men who had settled early in the colony in company with Samuel Rishworth, the opponent of slavery we mentioned earlier. They were sent to England as prisoners, where Carter expected they would be punished further. In fact, civil and religious tension was boiling over in England at exactly the same time, and the Puritans of London would see the men freed. While Providence was dealing with internal discord, the Spanish were making fresh plans. The admiral of the fleet in the recent attack was one Francisco Diaz de Pimienta, and he was determined to exact retribution for the humiliation of Spanish arms. He knew, from personal experience, that the island was a difficult target and would need greater preparation and resources than the previous offensives had used. He took his time to train his soldiers well, and on the 6th of May left Cartagena with 2,000 men in 12 ships, larger than both of the previous 2 assaults combined. They were sighted off Providence on the 17th of May, but Don Francisco did not rush to land his men. instead circling the island for a week, looking for a weakness in the island's defenses. He found it. The southeast of the island was lightly defended, for there the terrain was highest and most difficult to traverse. So, Don Francisco landed his men there and marched them right over the highest and most inaccessible part of the island to confront the English at their main settlement from the rear. The English were taken by surprise and confined themselves to the church and to the governor's house as the only defendable buildings. 2 days later, they accepted terms with the Spanish and surrendered. Very little fighting had taken place at all in the entire offensive. Don Francisco won his victory with intelligence rather than with brute force. Don Francisco showed himself to be not only a better commander than Andrew Carter, but a better man also, when he kept his word and did not execute any of his prisoners. The women and children were put on a ship to England immediately, while the men would spend some years as prisoners in Spain. The Spanish marked their victory with a mass and the singing of the Te Deum. And so the story of England's settlement on Providence Island comes to an end. The Spanish would now keep a permanent garrison on the island, and today the islands are part of Colombia. But for all the finality of Don Francisco's victory, English colonial ambitions continued to develop, and the various strains of colonialism we saw in Providence would have their own interlinked journeys. Providence Island colony tried to combine Puritanism, piracy, cash crops. All three would go on to have their role in the English and then British Empire, but they would be conducted somewhat more separately. Some of the residents escaped the Spanish and fled in small boats to other parts of the West Indies to continue their careers as pirates. They went to the Mosquito Coast and to Tortuga in particular. Over the course of the next century, the West Indies would enter its golden age of piracy, and the English would have a leading role in it. Puritans from England and from Bermuda would continue their expansion. They would consolidate New England, and they would eventually accept that this was the region that most suited their ideals, a temperate region away from the temptations of the tropics. The Bermudan Puritans made one more attempt at a West Indies colony. They attempted the settlement of the Bahamas. They even named the central island of the archipelago New Providence after their recently lost colony. And yet, predictably and ironically, this New Providence would become the most famous pirate haunt of the 18th century. So much for Caribbean Puritanism. It was the third strain, that of the slave-owning, cash crop-growing, adventuring capitalist, that won the battle for the soul of the English Caribbean. The rewards and temptations of such a model were too great for some Englishmen to resist, and this is the model that would be developed in the Lesser Antilles, the Bahamas, and ultimately in Jamaica. But that's a story for the future. What of the men in England who created the company and paid for the expedition? They were now fighting for the future of England in our bloody and vicious civil wars, Parliament against King, in which the Puritans played an enormous part. Perhaps they didn't need to create their utopia in the Americas after all. Perhaps they could make their truly Christian, Protestant, pure society in England. After a decade of conflict and revolution, England would have a new ruler, a Puritan at the very apex of power. And this man did indeed decide to reform English life on Puritan lines. But that was not enough. God had given him a mission to wrest the New World from the Spanish. He would dispatch the greatest transatlantic invasion force ever seen up to that point, in an attempt to conquer the West Indies and Spanish America. This man was Oliver Cromwell.